thanks very much. I think that what's interesting about what you presented is that one finds in neo-Vygotsky literature a lot a kind of denial that Vygotsky has any notion of stages of development. Yeah, and so I think it's a very interesting kind of tracing for us of what he actually said. And I wondered if you could comment on the similarities or differences that you see in Vygotsky's notion of these stages with crises and other kind of stage development models like the Piagetian model.
Oh look, I really don't know all that much about Piaget, and I know that any room full of child psychologists would be at least 50% who are. So I'm not in a position to make that contrast. You'll have gathered from a couple of my asides that it's very markedly and obviously in the Marxist tradition, okay, and therefore a Hegelian tradition, and there's quite a bit of Goethe in there as well. These sort of concepts of structural change, which usually the secondary literature said, Vygotsky was studying the Gestalt psychologist. This is completely wrong, because Vygotsky's word in this respect about the Gestalt psychologists is that they, let's try and get it right, they exposed the atom and discovered and replaced it with a molecule. Right? They discovered that understanding things as atoms isn't sufficiently Gestalt, so they settled for the molecule. Now, I've referred a number of times here to the Gestalt being the child with the social environment, the carers or whatever, taken as a whole. And as a whole form of life, which involves everyone, and the whole thing has to be transformed. And I think that approach to human development, which includes the individual, it's not just some broad structural observation, and also it's not an individualist kind of conception. It inextricably takes the person together with the way their needs are met. I mean, if you're wondering who's included in the family, you're talking about how a child's needs are met. So I think that's unique. Also, as far as I know, Vygotsky made no claim that these stages went on continuing through life. So in my own mind, it seems to run, sometimes he mentions a crisis at 17, sometimes not. Right? But there's no crisis beyond that age. And of course what adulthood meant in 1920 the Soviet Union would be so different from here and now. But I find that very easy to reconcile with, because it corresponds to what my favourite person Hegel says. Hegel, in a couple of his works, sees stages of development with these traumatic leaps and changes in between up to a point. But once you get to a point where, in a sense, the person's kind of discovered themselves. Yeah? There's a personality there. Not like a teenager whose personality is very underdeveloped and abstract. They've got beliefs, but they can't really stick up for them in a fight, so to speak. What happens for the rest of your life then is a concretisation of that. It's a completely different process than the series of overthrows that the poor child has to go through to get to that sort of critical point of saying, yeah, I'm here, I vote, I'm an adult, I'm going out to get a job, and so on. Don't know much, but they're on the voters register, so to speak. But from then on is learning things deeper. So, sorry about Piaget. You'll have to tell us about that. Or where's Ian? Ian can tell us about that. Is he not here? Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
I think Vygotsky died before he had his midlife crisis.
Yes.
Could well be. He was preparing for the Moscow trials at the time. That might have been his midlife crisis that he was having.
What you said about the think-do separation.
Sorry?
The separation between thinking and
doing.
Yeah.
Thinking and doing, yes.
I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about that and how, if Vygotsky talked about how he saw it happening. It seems such a crucial thing, where you said it's the beginning of reflective thinking.
Can I put it? It's not an open-shut question, this was. I've had lots of discussion with people really trying to clarify exactly what it means and at what point, what is really separate. What does it entail? Does this mean the kid doesn't know how to tell a lie? or is that not the critical thing? Is it metacognition and various things? Now, first thing I can say is there's the URL for the crucial section out of the problem of age that I've been resting on, and it's available on the web, and that's a good start. And if you don't get your answer there, there's the rest of volume 5, which I understand is in your library, or will be when Carol returns it. Now, the separation of thinking from behaviour. So if you're in a situation where I think pick up book, you do it. Right? So there's no mediation between the thought and the act. In a sense, it's almost like the thought isn't there because it's undifferentiated from behaviour. It's like a kind of reflection, a shadow of behaviour. Right? In order to control your behaviour, you have to differentiate them. You have to be able to sit there and have a thought. I wonder what I'll do today. Yeah? Intervening or mediating between going out and doing something. Also necessary before you can reflect on your thoughts. In fact, it's like one step further and say, I think a stage later than that, before you're able to do acts like, I got out of that by lying to my mother. Was that a good idea? And actually reflecting on your own behaviour. I think that's another step ahead. But the first thing is there has to be a separation between your thinking, in the sense of able to listen to yourself, and the actual doing it. It's not, you're not really a conscious human being when to think is to do. It has to be a separation. So it means the development of the intellect as a distinct function. See, when the child is very young and undeveloped, it can do lots of things. It's inherited straight from its animal biology. Wonderful, magical tricks. But the thing is that for instance, memory, you're born with certain cells and biological functions in your brain from remembering, and other animals have the same thing, and you can remember a certain amount of it. But first thing is it's quite limited, nowhere enough to get you through human society. So it's only when it's joined with the intellect and you remember by thinking, and then you're using symbols, you can do it. Now the thing is that requires, in order to control your memory and be able to memorise things and commit things to memory, the memory has to be differentiated out of the whole. So long as it's just an automatic biological function and it's not separated, as for instance, it is when it's connected to the intellect, you can't control it. You remember it or you don't, that's it. Right? But in order to be able to use symbols to control your memory and expand the point where you can read a book with thousands and thousands of words, that you haven't seen for a month of Sundays and get right through it. I mean, it's revolving memory, but it isn't sort of memory, it's not memorising, because your memory is continually being activated by perception thanks to your intellect. So all the basic functions reappear at a later stage of development, not as biological functions sort of situated in a certain part of the brain, but as combinations of these different functions, that where you have a kind of a reconstructed memory, which is connected to perception, intellect, motor movements and so on. So the memory then, in a sense, it's separate to start with, but you can't control it separately, because it's just an automated biological function. When it's reconstructed at a higher level, it's actually integrated into the entirety of the psyche, but that gives you voluntary control over it. Because I know how to memorise. I put things in alphabetical order, whatever, something. You can control it. Does that help?
Yeah. And the relationship between what's happening inside and the social.
Yeah.
Talk a bit louder.
Is the development of the using thinking through memorising. Is it the social activity that stimulates the...
Yeah, I understand what you're driving at there. But there's no doubt at all. I mean, I think it's kind of juvenile to try and claim that nothing changes within the organism when you learn or something. It's just nonsense. How can you... And you can't explain anything if one just says, oh, it's all in the social relations. Clearly, however it happens from the point of view of biology, we've developed abilities, you know, like you can run fast. That's not a social relation in itself, though of course its meaningfulness, its rewards, the ability to practice, motivation for it, all sorts, everything around it is developed socially, but still we know that if you've got long legs and big muscles and not too much fat, you run fast, especially for practice. Okay, thinking. So Vygotsky understands that thinking is an activity of people, but it's only within social relations. You know? Human being utterly on their own can't think. You know? To the extent that you might be momentary on your own, you're using words which you've acquired in the course of development, which have restructured your brain, so to speak, through their sound and their sight and their meaning, their attachment to other people, and association with experience. So all the content and form of your thinking apparatus, your psyche, is imported from outside. And Vygotsky says somewhere, everything that goes on within the psyche previously happened socially. Okay? Now, to understand the process, it is possible to talk about someone's mind, possible to talk about someone's social relation. It's not absolutely ruled out. You can't make these objects of interest and discussion. It's not against the rule to think of this one and that one, but to understand them, you have to take them to Gestalt. Thought is incomprehensible outside of the system of inexplicable and meaningless outside of a specific activity, system of actions organised around cultural products, artefacts, words, for example. Does that do it? So what that means for the child who's trying to grow up, it's not, of course, if it's growing up, but a child who's growing up, is that they can make a certain development, but since they only know their past life, it's very limited, it has to be actualised. You know what I mean by this term, actualised? It's like I've got an idea, but I can't quite picture it. But if you have an opportunity to actualise it, even on a small scale, or maybe do a drawing, or talk about it with someone else, put it into words, hear those words, hear someone else's reaction, if something becomes part of the world, it begins to take definite form. And that's absolutely essential for that function, that idea, that activity, that thought to develop. So that actualisation is where even the most private thought, if it's going to develop, enters into the relation between you and other people and so on. Right? So that word actualisation, I think, is important to understand development there. Okay? Yes?
When you're talking about memory, right, in two different terms.
Thank you.
You're talking about memory. When you were talking about memory as a simple biological function, and then memory in the context of intellect coming into it, how then would you put animals and humans and their different use of memory into that?
Well, to the overwhelming degree, I won't say all the time, because someone nowadays, there was this professor in Tucson who made a monkey do this or something. Okay, but to overwhelming extent, memory in animals is a built-in, biologically hardwired process. Yeah? Of course, as like any memory, associations develop. It's not just a list of photographs. It develops in the course of life, but it's a biological function that the animal may either remember something or not. Now, human memory is quite different. It doesn't really reside in that part of the brain tissue at all. That part, the brain tissue just plays a subordinate role. Okay, we know things, we remember things because we're connected to them in our experience by all sorts of symbols. So it's almost like a different function. So when we talk about a person's memory, it's in its biological foundation is something completely different from animal memory. There may be some gorilla who's learned tricks to remember things, but that's exceptional. They must have learned them off the human. Okay.
See if I have a mic.
Oh.
I have a question. Can I ask a question that's not related to today's talk? Or should I rather ask that?
Yeah, since I'm leaving in about an hour, I think now's the time.
Okay. It's to go back to your contribution of project collaboration and my question. I read the chapters in your book, and so my question is to help me clarify confusion. My question is a collaborative project a unit of analysis, or is it a way of understanding context? Or is it the unit of analysis when we want to understand context?
Yeah. The unit of analysis is a relative term. The unit of analysis is the concept of a whole process. Okay, so for each different problem, if you're going to successfully understand it, you require a unit of analysis. So the question, it's nonsense to say is it a unit of analysis, because there's always in your third option a unit of analysis for some problem. Okay? Now, is that problem context? Well, yes, I tried to show that context is a problematic concept, but we nevertheless needed something to explain why people did what they did. And broadly, you wanted to look outside the immediate environment of an action and the interpersonal interactions going on there to a wider context. And in activity theory, that is generally called an activity. As Leontief gradually parted way from Vygotsky's Marxist approach, he referred to an activity. But he never really explained what made an activity an activity. He didn't say "and," of course, because he spoke Russian, and could only say, well, I forget the word, but activity or something, without a or a verb before it, thus confusing generations of English speakers thereafter that thought that a mass, or continuous entity, a mass noun, could be a unit, which of course it can't. But anyway, an activity. So I'm trying to give a definite form you can recognise to the idea which is posited by Leontief, but in he did fill it in to some extent, but I think in a way that was unsatisfactory, a collaborative project. It's very close to what Leontief supposed, because he took it as every activity is defined by its object. And what you're doing is defined by what you're trying to achieve. And the larger societal units of activity were trying to achieve something defined on a societal level, so there's something called objective motives. Now, I don't think that leads you anywhere, quite frankly. But with the idea of a project is both something that has an objective societal existence, and it's sustained by the fulfilling of individual needs, and it's objective, trying to escape from the mess of the subjective or objective motives, or hidden or real motives, and say that a project actually realises its motive. You thought you were going to make a free and democratic government, turned out you made a real mess. Right? But that only came out as the project realised itself. So it's a learning process as well. And it's not just an individual learning off someone that knows better, it's a collective process of learning in the real world and discovering things for the first time. It's a social learning process as well. But it is a unit of analysis for, I would say, social life, put it that way. Because not necessarily, context refers to the context of something. Right? So I'd say a unit of social life. Dominic.
It's really trying to fill in the time. Maybe look at this. Today you're describing the child's development, and you quoted something that said the final situation of the child, or
or the adult rather, would be somebody who could reproduce the culture. There's a whole list, quite a good list, defining that. And then there was something that said the social forms the individual. I think it was one of the slides, the quotation of Vygotsky. And then the other day you said, you quoted from the Communist Manifesto, the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, from the Communist Manifesto, which is actually the reverse order, isn't it? Well, maybe it is, or not. But
I think we're looking at the same thought there, and in a sense, one can really only argue about the priority, can't you? I mean, freedom. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'm asking because we've looked here completely in a way that is isolated from the development of society at the child, and at some stage you say, well, are there any further developments? Vygotsky doesn't speculate. But there is a continuity, maybe, this is my question, where society now becomes the field in which these sort of periods of quantitative change are ruptured by revolutionary.
This sounds like a great question for me to end on, but I'm still trying to pack it in. I'm piling up these aspects that you're raising. So can I reply at this point? Yeah. Look, there's two questions in here. My point was that in the development of a human individual, that lasts something probably less than a century, there's a period in which there's a series of revolutions in the person's life, where they stop being newborn, become an infant, stop being an infant, become a young child, and so on, up until a point where the end is, that they are a fully competent member of society. If, for example, they never went through that, that may be what the midlife crisis is about. I wonder if they never went through that crisis of the young teens, or sometimes called the crisis of puberty, that was nothing to do with sex, and just sort of worked in dad's business, voted for the Tories or whatever it was, married the childhood sweetheart, and all of a sudden, at a certain point in life, what am I doing? And they have their 13-year-old crisis and say, this is a load of rubbish, I'm throwing all this out. And mum says, oh, at last you've caught up, boy, get off with you. That's possible. But other things being equal, there's a distinction between the two phases of development, which, since you know Hegel, Dominic, the doctrine of essence covers that series of development of opposites, right? Which is all those phases of development, where we're separated into different antagonistic aspects, and the different aspects of the whole are all building up, right? And then you get to the beginning of the doctrine of the notion, where an abstract concept is established, comes out of all that mess of struggle and strife. And that's, of course, also the unit of analysis, right? If you understand a person, then you don't go to their family background, you go to their first appearance as a youth, and in my experience, that's often where you really get to the heart of what the concept of that person is. So you've got all that, and then, of course, Hegel says something like, thereafter, each successive concept is forthwith declared as the same and subsumed within it. So every new development a person goes through after they reach adulthood isn't like a total walk away from what I was before and become something different, but it's included in. Right? You put on layers and layers, you begin to get a few battle scars, a few bumps on the corners, you learn that things don't always go like that, you learn to have a bit more tolerance maybe, and so on, okay? So it's a different kind of development than what you go through as a child, nothing like that. Now the second aspect of what you say is, what about the larger picture? Is that a fair way of summarising it? Now, Vygotsky believed that he was he was a part of a project to create an alternative socialist man. He was very his image of the development of the Soviet Union was a gradual improvement to a better kind of human being, and his role in that was to try and fix up some problems of psychology and education in the chaos he saw around him. There's no evidence that I know of that suggests he developed any kind of social theory. Now, while my efforts are directed largely to overcoming the mutual alienation between psychology and social theory, but that doesn't mean you forthwith declare them to be one, of course, and subsume a theory of social development under the theory of the development of an individual. But when you read this stuff, you cannot but note that the general concepts and schema that Vygotsky brings to his theory of child development in the early 30s almost come straight out of various works of Marx and Engels on social and historical development. This whole idea of the contradiction being between the way your needs are met and your needs. That's the central contradiction of any gestalt, any system whereby people's needs are being provided. In a certain sense, the very way that the society is living comes into conflict with its needs. He just translated that very broad idea of a contradiction that comes to a head at a certain point and demands that the system be reorganised from a form of production producing the goods that the whole society needs and the way those needs develop under that form of life. The whole idea of the change in the parts producing a gradual change in the whole, but at a certain point you can only continue forward by a total rearrangement of the parts, which thereby doesn't change, like when the workers seize power, they've got the same factories, the same trams, the same human beings that they had the day before, but things have been reorganised. Someone else is in charge, these are nationally owned, and so on. Now, it just seems to me, you read him writing this, you say, man, this just put down, his copy of Capital, the Andy Brumaire or something. But it's only copying ideas. I mean, Vygotsky is not a crude person. He doesn't. In fact, his early life is spent fighting against in a society suddenly set up where Marxism is the official ideology. You've got everyone under the sun bringing forward a Marxist psychology. A quote from here, a quote from there, stick something I heard Comrade Stalin say yesterday in the picture, and there we go, Marxist psychology. So he's very hostile to anything simplistic. But he immersed himself in a certain literature, which was predominantly, it was to a large measure, a Marxist literature. He's surrounded, in the wake of the revolution, surrounded by people excited by, motivated by the revolution and the ideas of that revolution. Time? Yeah, I know, I'm just winding up now. 7 minutes after 2, throat going. Okay. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone. producing the goods that the whole society needs and the way those needs develop under that form of life. The whole idea of the change in the parts producing a gradual change in the whole, but at a certain point you can only continue forward by a total rearrangement of the parts, which thereby doesn't change. Like when the workers cease power, they've got the same factories, the same trams, the same human beings as the day before, but things have been reorganised. Someone else is in charge, there's a nationally owned, and so on. Now, it just seems to me, when you read in writing this, you say, man, it's just put down, you know, it's a copy of Capital or the Annie Brumaire or something. But it's only copying ideas. I mean, Vygotsky is not a crude person. You know? He doesn't, in fact, his early life he spent fighting against, in a society which is suddenly set up where Marxism is the official ideology. You've got everyone under the sun bringing forward Marxist psychology. You know, quote from here, quote from there, stick something over the column and say, yesterday in the picture, there, you've got Marxist psychology. So he was very hostile to anything simplistic. But he immersed himself in a certain literature, which was predominantly, to a large measure, a Marxist literature. Surrounded in the wake of the revolution, surrounded by people excited by, motivated by the revolution, the ideas of that revolution. Time? Yeah, I know, just winding up now. 7 minutes after 2, throat going. Okay. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone.